Hey everyone, welcome back to the Rooted in Resilience podcast. Today we are so excited to have Kate Kavanaugh on to talk about her, she's just badass. She's badass. So she is a butcher, she is a farmer, and she is just able to talk about the cycle of life and how humans can fit into this cycle of life and the relationship that we have with nature so beautifully, so eloquently. And we're also going to dive into some real talk about the realness behind regenerative agriculture, behind butchery, and understanding this real talk kind of gives the consumer a better perspective as to why conventional agriculture has exploded and why it's more important now than ever to continue to support your local farmers and support these local businesses. So let's start. Kate, who is Kate? And can you provide a little background of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for having me on, Ash and Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to have this conversation. I think it's an important one, and one that we don't always get to hear. I'll keep my background short because I think we're going to dive into far more interesting things, but I like to tell people that I really came into this industry because I led a childhood that was very disconnected. And I think it was disconnected in the way that so many of us experience. I grew up in a city and had no concept of where my food came from, but it was also disconnected in that there's a lot of difficult things going on for me, both at home in school. And I found that I really wanted to escape my life. And this heart of disconnection really became the impetus for me seeking a greater connection in my later years, as I think so many of us find that our wounds give us a path into our purpose. But for me, one of the biggest things that happened for me during childhood was in sort of an attempt to control things. And I think many of us come to this space because of this. I decided to become a vegetarian at a very early age. It was a way that I felt like I could avoid death. There was a lot of death happening in my household growing up. And it was a way that I felt like I could control this little piece of my life. And the reasoning behind it evolved throughout my childhood and into my teenage years, from something that was very animal welfare focused to something that became both animal welfare and environmentally focused. And then around the age of 20, I decided to start eating meat again, and knew that I wanted to be as connected as I possibly could be to that space, and started visiting farms and ranches that we would now deem regenerative. That word wasn't in the cultural lexicon at this time. This was 15 years ago. And so it was a little bit of a different space. And that opened up this door where I wanted to find a deeper connection ecologically, environmentally, to my food, to a community that was growing my food, and led me into opening a butcher shop in 2013, Western Daughters in Denver, Colorado, and eventually into farming myself and into running the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where I tell a lot of stories that are farming or environmentally adjacent. And so quick background.
Wow. What a past and what a story. It's really cool to kind of see your full circle, like the cycle of life in nature. You kind of went full circle yourself. And I honestly think that putting a pin on that point of, making this decision to be vegetarian because it removes yourself from death. I think that that's going to be something that's going to come up later in our discussion as to why it is so hard to be a regenerative livestock rancher and a butcher these days, because the average consumer believes that that is the best way for both the environment, animal health, and human health. And that is just such a pervasive thought process throughout our culture.
Yes.
And it's having negative consequences on not only human health, clearly, but on small businesses that are raising food as nature intended.
I also think that the concept of vegetarianism as a way to control something in your life is really interesting, because escaping that required you to like not necessarily lose control, but allow yourself to trust your intuition and your innate cravings. And I feel like that going through that process itself is really complex but beautiful. Mm-hmm. So I want to hear more about how that played out for you. I feel like before we dive into the agriculture, I know you said we're going to talk about more interesting things, but you are a very interesting specimen. And so can you just expand on that really quickly, like what it took for you to shift your perspective, and like did that require any psychological shifts for you? And like what did you have to give up of your past self in order to become the Kate that you became in your 20s and now 30s?
Yeah. So I think I kind of want to see if I can weave together these two questions, because I think that a lot of us, and there are a lot of us that were vegetarians, that were vegans, or some iteration of that, was this attempt to control or avoid death, which is something that is very hidden from us in our culture. And it's hidden from us in a lot of different ways. It's hidden from us in our agricultural sector, where we really outsource death to these places behind big walls. We never see it. We never experience it. Whereas throughout human history, we were hunters, and death would have been a very much a part of our existence. And even within agriculture, over the last 12, 13,000 years, death was something that we were connected to. We were also connected to the death of our loved ones. We were undertakers. The funeral industrial complex has actually only really gained steam in the last 150 years. And before that, we always cared for our dead. And so in many ways, this is sort of a novel concept. And I think that when we have this fear of death, and when we remove death culturally, you see a lot of the things that I think we're actually going to talk about. This idea that growth can happen in perpetuity, the idea of how businesses scale or corporate interests are driven. And to answer you, I really had to go through this process of coming home to an idea of death, and also allowing a part of myself to die, right? That these were ideas that I had deeply held on to, that had formed an aspect of my identity in my formative years, where I was a vegetarian, and that was a part of my story of what it meant to be me during that time. And a lot of that broaching and coming into the idea of death was experiencing health problems that were very pervasive, and that I really wanted to get out of, that I wanted to find a deeper level of connection, of intuition, as you so perfectly put it, with myself. And that required of me to let go of some of these ideas that I had had, and to have sort of this death process of that ego that was involved in that, and to come home to what my body needed, and being able to listen to that. And at the time I was suffering from, and had throughout all of my childhood, I was a heavily medicated child, and had weaned myself off a lot of psychiatric medications in my teen years, and still hadn't found the level of health that I was looking for from a mental standpoint. I still had a lot of anxiety. I still had a lot of gut health issues, and a lot of skin issues and fatigue issues. And that's really what led me into something that I'm not doing isn't working. And I'm hungry. I'm truly hungry. And I was hungry for meat. And there was a lot of letting go of all of those ideas, as well as stepping into wanting to witness death and to understand that piece of the food system that is baked into, I believe, every aspect of the food system. And so that was one of the first places I actually went. Was I killed one of my own chickens. We were raising some birds in our front yard in Phoenix, Arizona, and one of them had become a rooster, and I killed him and ate him for dinner. And that was actually one of those really seminal moments for me of wanting to connect in that full circle way.
So I'm just going to share some thoughts I have about this whole, fear of death, cycle of life, and this innate wisdom in the human body for this desire for meat. I think all of us have a similar upbringing. We were raised in cities, suburbs, disconnected from farms, got food from the grocery store. But then all of us seem to have gotten to this place where we were hungry, like you said. I thought that was beautiful. We were hungry for more. And we then searched for local farms. And I have very vivid memories of seeing the families at these local farms. And these kids are exposed to the cycle of life, to death from a very young age. And so then their entire life from that point, it's immediately obvious what we are supposed to do as humans, what we are supposed to eat. And I think that lack of experience as a young childhood breeds confusion and fear of death because we don't have those pivotal experiences as a young child. And so then as we enter corporate worlds and as we are now experiencing propaganda from these large marketing firms and these large food firms, we don't have that base understanding of kind of what it is meant to be human. And it's easier to just blindly listen to these mass marketing messages that are for corporate profit interests of you can avoid death by drinking oat milk, or these like Beyond Meat patties, and these are healthier for you. Whereas a child that grew up on a farm and had these experiences and killed a rooster to make a stew, the question of what you're supposed to eat as a human in these experiences is not even there because it's just ingrained in who you are. And so a part of me feels like as a young child, I think that school systems it's hard because how do you say, all right, class, we're going to go butcher chickens today at a farm. But like experiencing that at farms at a young age, I think is really important. And that's something that we want to do here at the farm at some point is really have child programs where kids who are growing up in cities can come here and see how food is actually produced. And so that I know for me was like a huge missing piece of why I went on this like decade long of confusion of nutrition.
Well, also, just like set up for failure with your own health. I mean, you go through so many different diets, and you said you were on medication growing up and all these different things that damage that microbiome that, I mean, we probably never had to begin with because we weren't raised in an environment that would have cultivated a healthy microbiome. So
it's passed down from your mother too. I mean, your first, inoculation is coming through the birth canal if you did and through breast milk. Yeah, we are holobionts, that we are an organism that is together with our microbiome, right? It outnumbers us at a cellular level from 10 to 1, more 10 to 1 microbial cells to our 1.
Yeah, so we're basically set up for failure in many ways. But, hearing your story and knowing, what it obviously wasn't easy the last some amount of years, but seeing where you are now and that you did the hard work to reconnect yourself and that process itself helped you find a healthier state is really inspiring because it's never too late to say goodbye to, all those messages that we're bombarded with and then restart a new life. So the birth of the new Kate Kavanaugh is such a beautiful story. I'm glad we got to understand that more as we start this conversation.
I want to say too, because I think that a word came up that's really important here, which is disembodied, right? And I think that our food, as we see it in the grocery store when we're growing up in cities or in suburbs, is disembodied. We don't feel that it comes from bodies. It feels almost as if it grows on trees. Here it is in these little hermetically sealed packages, and there's no trace of what it might once have been. And at the same time, we ourselves experience, I think, a lot of disembodied feelings, that we are in environments that have a big mismatch with our biology technology. We're sat at a desk for 8 hours a day and expected to sit still and pay attention in a way that I think is antithetical to childhood. And I think that there are a lot of different forces, and now with technology, that get us out of our bodies, that we are disembodied and we are disconnected from those feelings of intuition and those cravings that are natural. And I think what you mentioned, Ash, about what Nicolette Nyman calls the intangible benefits of raising children on farms and ranches is this opportunity to see a part of our food system, and not just to see death, but to see what it looks like to have a carrot grown in situ, or to forage in the woods for mushrooms, and to begin to get a sense of, I think, interbeingness, right? That we are a part of an ecosystem and of this concert of life that I think actually informs a different way of viewing the world. Because so much of what you said is that we're kind of inculcated in these ideas that are passed down from mother culture in terms of the propaganda and the news that we see, and we're kind of sold this story about who people are in relationship to food, in relationship to environment, and in relationship to one another. And we have an opportunity to hopefully change that.
We do have an opportunity, but I think that it is going to come with serious consumer re-education, because it really is going to come down to consumer support and where we put our dollars every single day. And so I think if you guys are open to it, if we could give a little real talk about how hard it is right now to farm. I would say most people in this space that are not farmers themselves, but are interested in supporting regenerative farmers, supporting local food systems. I think that those people are great and we need more of them, but sometimes they don't understand the realness and the behind the scenes of how hard it is in this current conventional centralized agriculture system that has been bred by this mass propaganda and fear mongering of corporate interests to make a civilization that just wants food grown at a grocery store where they don't have to think about death at all. And so Kate owns a butcher shop, and she's she is 10 years in. And so Kate, I'd love to hear some behind the scenes of how hard it has been to run a butcher shop and what are the challenges that you face regularly.
Yeah, I want to say at the outset, too, that I actually think that there are a lot of challenges for the consumer as well, and that a lot of this is predicated in us better understanding the challenges that this system faces as a whole and as a concert, and to sort of build some bridges in that space. And hopefully I can kind of speak to that a little bit as well, but we are 10 years in running the butcher shop, and I started this, I think, in the way that many of us get into farming or get into agriculturally adjacent industries, where I was really starry-eyed and had this idea that I wanted to save the prairie one steak at a time. Our butcher shop is in Denver, in the high plains, and what the high plains grows really well is grass. And so to me, that felt like the idea of putting ruminants back on the land in, what we might call a regenerative style was the best way to really nourish that ecosystem while also nourishing bodies. And 10 years in, I still feel exactly the same way, but there have been a lot of hurdles. And I know that we were talking a little bit before we hopped on, but I'm in this space where I'm giving the butcher shop about a year to turn things around, or we are going to close it. That we have sort of limped along for a very long time. There's only been a handful of years that were in the black, and we have tried a lot of different things to make it work at an economic level and have just failed to do so. And I want to talk about, because I kind of see this as a triangle of difficulty. And you have farmers and ranchers. you have consumers, and then you have any third party. This is going to include slaughterhouses, it's going to include butcher shops. And I feel like each shareholder in this triangle is facing a lot of difficulty where it's tough to make ends meet and to be able to support the system. So on the farming and ranching side, you have an average profit margin of 2.4% as of 2021, I think. I have a bunch of statistics pulled out over here.
As a note, I think that the profit margins in the supplement industry are close to 80%. So just take a moment to really sink that in. 2% to 80%.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's an average of 2.4%, right? So that means that a lot of people are actually operating in the red. And there are a lot of...
And you now understand why most farmers have to have an off-the-farm job.
So 84% of farm income in the 82% of total income for family farms as of 2019 was actually from off-farm income. Mm-hmm. And so that is a staggering statistic. That means that the vast majority of farmers are not making money farming and are having to support their farming habit with off-farm income, some out of necessity, and this is a really big issue. And so there's one sector, there's farmers and ranchers, and we can tease more of any of this out. And I have a bunch of statistics with me too, because I think that there are a lot of things that go into why that's the case, and I think we'll probably want to pick that apart a little bit. Then you have consumers, and I think that consumers also in many ways have their backs against the wall. I think that we have a rising cost of living. I think that rent is getting much more expensive, and we are creating a world of renters. I think that you see capital interests buying up properties to rent them back to people, and that taking up increasing more of income, all these services. And so people are struggling to afford nutrient-dense food. And I want to make sure that we include that piece, because I think that that is an important piece. And then on the third party, the slaughterhouses, the butcher shops, the aggregators that I do think we need at times, right? We need to have some economies of scale, because without these entities, we are asking farmers to be marketers and PR people and shipping managers and delivery drivers and all of these different things. And so at the end of the day, I think that there is a place for direct to consumer, but there also is a place for aggregation. And so any butcher shop, but this also includes slaughter, also aren't making a lot of money. And now I'll speak to the butcher shop specifically. 50 cents of every dollar that you spend at Western Daughters goes back to a farmer or rancher. I think this is amazing, because I want to pay farmers and ranchers a living wage so that they can in turn pay the people that work for them a living wage. And I don't think we cover farm workers enough in these conversations either. And then I pay my employees about 30 cents of every dollar that is spent, because we're in a city with an incredibly high cost of living, incredibly high cost of rent. Want them to be able to have a quality of life. And then I have 20 cents left over for, that is rent, electricity, trash, paper goods, all of our butcher paper. And that doesn't include paying me or my husband. And so at the end of the day, most of the time we are in the red. And what I have found in this industry is that if you have a business that is paying farmers well, then they are not doing well. And if you have a business that is doing well, then they are not paying farmers well. And I think at the end of the day, that is a system that isn't working. And in addition to this, right, there is a ceiling on what consumers will spend. And this is in part their perception of what the cost of food is, as it has been artificially suppressed because of subsidies and corporate interests. And I think that this is also just a part of the cost of living being incredibly expensive right now, and it being truly hard to afford food.
Yeah, I think on the subsidies thing, I think that's something that a lot of us forget about, in that some of our tax dollars, some percentage of it goes to government subsidization of certain crops. And those crops, I think the 5 are corn, soy, wheat, rice, and I'm missing the 5th one.
I'm not sure. Might be alfalfa. I'm not sure.
Those subsidies then make those costs lower. So those are things that we don't see in our day-to-day spending. But then that means that anything that doesn't use those 5 items, or, sometimes organic production of those things that aren't part of that government subsidization, those are going to be higher input costs for farmers to use if they're not using these other items. And so I think that that's a very hard, it's a sneaky thing that's embedded in our agriculture system. Yeah. I don't know how we're getting out of government farm subsidies.
I don't either.
I haven't heard a good solution to get out of it. And that really makes like you said, the perception of food cost really challenging, because now we have this artificially low price for certain goods.
And I think on the other topic you brought up about how you didn't directly say this, but there's a lot of components to serving up that ground beef packet, or, that sausage or ribeye steak. Somebody might see the price as like X amount per pound, but they don't see the multi-step process that took place, the amount of businesses or people that it took to produce that product. Like, I would say most people don't even recognize that their meat had to go through a butcher shop in order to, be in the package, to be on their plate, especially if it's something like bacon or a smoked sausage or something. So when you brought up how the consumer has their back against the wall as well, it's like, it's literally not their fault at all. Like the problems that we're talking about, because we have been so far removed from the process of creating food.
And that's what they want. That is to their interest, right, to keep us as far away from that as possible.
So like the prices probably don't make sense to people. They're like, if it was just the farmer who was doing all of these different steps, and they had it all on their farm and they didn't have to transport the meat to a slaughterhouse or something like that, maybe you would be like, oh wow, it doesn't need to be that expensive. But there are so many different businesses and people that go into the process of creating the product that we end up buying, that it's really hard to wrap your head around it if you're not exposed to it.
Well, and I think that this is actually universal throughout all industries. I don't think that this is unique to farming. A number of years ago, in the 90s, there was a study done at the Land Institute, which Wes Jackson runs in Kansas, and it was called the Sunshine Farm. And him and this, forget, he's a statistician, something, went and they calculated the kilojoules of energy that were going into every aspect of their farm. And he went all the way back to the iron ore that was mined in Michigan to make the pieces for the tractor, right? And I think that it is very rare as a consumer for us to consider all the steps any given thing took to make it into our hands. And this is just our lack of knowledge about process, because we no longer fabricate or make anything. And so in that, I don't think we consider what lithium mining or cobalt mining in the Congo looks like for us to make car batteries or components of our cell phones, any more than we think about how much a pivot wheel costs for a farmer that was irrigating a bit of pasture, or how much they're paying in land costs if they haven't, if they don't have a family generational farm, or how much they're paying in or not paying themselves in labor, or how much some of these incidental costs actually cost. And so I think that exposing process is something that would serve us really well to do across all industries.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So, understanding the actual process, and I don't know the best way to expose people to this, because
let's dive into just a ribeye steak. Let's just briefly walk through this. So there's the whole, as a farmer, you have to continuously have birth.
Let's do bacon.
Okay, bacon. We have to continuously have new birth of pigs. You can't just like, so you were mentioning in the beginning, like we have disconnected from death. We are also so disconnected from birth, and we fear birth, but like those two things are necessary to continue the cycle of life. So we have to continuously have new births of animals. Those animals need to be fattened up, and that can be through supplemental feed, forage,
Time.
what?
Or time.
And time. It takes a lot of time. And then in the old days, those animals would be slaughtered on farm, and those slaughtered animals would be taken to a local butcher shop and cut up and served to the local community. Now, the slaughter and butcher process has been so centralized that 80 to 90% of the meat that we buy as American consumers are controlled by 4 firms. Mm-hmm. And that is an astronomical centralization. In most other industries, that should be lower than 30%, and it's above 80% in the meat industry, which just shows you how centralized the meat processing and the control of the final meat that we consume is. And so ideally, in the most ideal world, the farmer would take the pig to a local processor, a local butcher like yourself, and have it cut up. But now, with processing plants closing down across the country because of this centralization, because of China and Smithfield coming in and owning so much of the meat packaging industry, farmers commonly have to travel 4 to 10 hours to take their animals to a slaughterhouse. That is an extremely stressful process for the animals, and the logistics of that are a nightmare as a farmer.
Well, can you, so there are local butchers, but can you explain why most consumers won't be able to purchase meat from a local butcher? Meaning, like, if they're going to buy meat from a store. Because I don't think you're talking about the process of necessarily like a direct farm to consumer. You know what I'm saying?
No.
Yeah, let's clarify. Is this conventional, or is this, a very small micro farm? Because those two supply chains look different.
The regulate, so for example, if we wanted to sell our meat from an FDA inspected facility versus somebody who just goes to Kate's.
So
even for
this is going to vary state by state too, and I want to say that at the outset.
Even more challenging.
So
it makes it very confusing for a consumer.
So meat in any given situation, so wherever you are, and let's speak to smaller farms at this time, okay? So I'm not speaking to farms that sort of go into the Cargill, JBS Swift supply chain, but people that are working to go direct to consumer or are doing smaller, more local aggregation.
Like farmers markets, things like that.
Yeah, whether that's farmers. Yeah, absolutely. And so let's kind of speak to that. And I think that first of all, you have land costs. And this is number one. And this is changing a lot. And there's a great book called Fields of Gold by Madeline Fairburn, looking at the financialization of farmland that is driving up farm costs. And so there are land costs if you don't just own outright your generational family farm, even though even then there are going to be taxes. And so then there's, the purchasing of stock, the time investment, both from a labor standpoint and from water, electricity, all gasoline, if you're using a tractor for anything that is going to be used to further service that animal, any feed that you are bringing in, whether that is hay or even if it's just a low PUFA feed for your hogs or your birds, whatever that is, that's going to be yet another input. Any incidentals like tractor wheels, just maintenance, general farm costs of doing that. And then you reach that point where that animal needs to go to slaughter. Now, this is going to vary on a state-by-state basis. There's both USDA processing and there is state processing. Some states will only have one, some states will have both. And I think that actually small processors are doing okay. They're very busy, and I think that's good for business, but it's also a real bottleneck. A lot of small processors you're going to see booking 2 years out, which is wild. This is before animals are even born, that you need a slot at these small processors, and their margins are tight as well. And so then, that farmer is going to take that animal to either a USDA or a state inspected processor before it can reach consumers' hands. And what's going to happen there is the animal is going to be killed. It is going to be dressed. The hide is going to be removed. The guts are going to be removed. And eventually you're going to get back about 50% of that carcass yield. And so that's important to remember too, that even, that weight, that hanging weight is going to be reduced, even after that. And so all of this has gone into that animal. Is that a good summation? Tell me if it wasn't.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. And so then there are some butcher shops or some slaughterhouses that do both slaughter and butcher, or like yourself, it's just a slaughterhouse and then the carcass.
Just butcher.
Just a butcher shop. And so the carcass is then taken to the butcher shop to cut up and package. And ultimately, Kate, you have one of the most important jobs because the consumer doesn't see all of those steps prior. They only see the final product. And so if the final product doesn't look good, it isn't packaged well, if it doesn't taste good, then the consumer will ask for a refund. And all the work that the farmer did doesn't mean anything. It's hard for the consumer to see that, right? And so you as a butcher control the final step, which controls the final delivery of the product to the consumer. You hold a very important job.
I think it's an important job, but I don't think it is any more important than any step of the way. And I think that our food is a co-creation of many different hands that touch it. And I think it's our job to look at and find those people, to witness them and to witness their part in the process.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've actually spent a lot of time the last several weeks going and visiting different local butcher shops and local slaughterhouses to kind of, talking to other farmers too, to understand the quality of the different places and how that might vary. So I'm very curious about your own business there. And like you mentioned that you feel like you have maybe one more year of seeing, if it's going to work.
Yeah.
Can you speak to what goes into that decision? Like, is it, something that's just become too much of a strain on your
finances, but
well, right. But I'm saying, like, how have you compartmentalized that in your head? Like, what's really going to make that decision for you, just so we can better understand what's going on?
I think we have an interesting question to ask ourselves as businesses right now. And I've been asking myself a lot of these questions, right? I always say that what keeps me up at night is that we're paying farmers, better than anyone else, and it's still not enough. We're paying our employees decently, and it's still not enough. And that the butcher shop then can't make money. And one of the words that has really come up for me in all of this is integrity. That throughout this process, if I were to switch to conventional meat, I would actually probably be profitable tomorrow. But because we do regenerative, 100% grass-fed and finished beef and lamb, pasture-raised pork and chicken, that our costs of goods sold is just too high for it to be tenable for the business. And I think that we have to ask ourselves as business owners, like, what is it that we need to survive? And I have accepted that the butcher shop will not pay me again. And that's all right. But I can have other jobs that support me, maybe, hopefully. But what I want is for it to be able to sustain itself and to sustain a healthy ecosystem, healthy wages for farmers and employees, and still at least break even. And this is my goal. I want it to break even. And that's all I need. And I think that these are hard questions to ask ourselves of our businesses, like what we need. And we run a very different business, right? Where industry standard on yield from carcass is 67%. We get 87%. We are using almost every piece. We make broth, we make sausages, we make bacon, we smoke meats, we do some prepared foods. We do all of these different components, and we do them all with that same level of integrity, right? Where does my salt come from? It comes from Redmond's. Where do my herbs come from? Well, they're all organic, and all of my spices are organic, and we use spring water to make our bone broth. And this matters to me because I think that we are selling people transparency, and I want that to be full transparency, but I think in that transparency, there has to be some of the transparency of hardship. And this is actually one of the biggest questions I've asked myself as we consider what it might mean to close is, how much do you begin to tell consumers? Because I think that we have, in the marketing world, created this space where we close off process. I mean, so much of what we've just talked about, whether it's what it takes to make an electric car battery or what it takes to produce a slab of bacon, we don't understand that process because that's not part of marketing. Right. It's not fun. Maybe it's not sexy enough. And it's definitely not sexy to say, hey, we are having troubles making this work. And I think that as much as we see greenwashing, I think we see a lot of hope washing and sugarcoating too.
Yeah. So provided that most of our listeners are not farmers, they're not butchers, they are consumers, how do you suggest that the consumer treads forward, taking into consideration everything you just said about, maybe and these are the products that they want, like everything you just described about a spring water bone broth and organic spiced meats, like that is, people who listen to this podcast are probably like, oh wow, like I'm going to go look up her butcher shop, right? Like that's incredible. You are setting a standard and you're doing everything with integrity, like you said, which is what is, vital to you feeling right moving forward. So then how do we shift the conversation and talk about what the consumer can do to help people like you carry forward and break even, right? And be able to continue to provide them the food that they want. I mean, we don't want poor quality food that was made without the love and intention that you provide.
Yeah, like who wants bone broth made from tap water with birth control and pharmaceutical drugs in it?
Right? So, yeah, I guess like that's the next thing I want to talk about is what the people listening to this podcast, can start thinking about, and small feasible actions they can take to start moving the needle forward, so businesses like your own can survive the upcoming struggles that are inevitably coming.
So the first one is going to be kind of funny, and I want to say this at the outset. The first one is that I think consumers need to not internalize that the onus is on them to completely overhaul the system. Because I think we are sold that at every corner, right? Where all of these corporations spend, who knows how much jet fuel going hither and yon, and then tell us that it's on us to just make sure that we don't use plastic straws. I think that's actually been very insidious. And I don't think internalizing that messaging as a space of guilt is a good way to move forward. And so I actually want to put that caveat on this at the front. And I think the second thing that is most important for consumers is to become curious. That so much of what we're talking about here is becoming curious about what it takes to raise food, what goes into the process of food, what the differences are between conventional and regenerative and small and big and local and centralized, to get into all of this and to just have a healthy sense of curiosity. And the third thing, and I think that this is really simple, is just to connect within your community. I think that for time immemorial, we have been made out of place, that all of the nutrients that we get have come from our little ecosystem or ecoregion, that we are made up of those plants and those animals and the microbiome that we share with a forest or the field or in a hug with our farmer and rancher. And all of these things become us, right? And I think that we are not just missing the nutrients in the soil or in this really beautifully raised meat. We are also missing the nutrient of community and the nutrient of story of where our food came from, which has always been a big part of the stories we would sit around a campfire and tell ourselves. And so to find a local farmer or rancher and to go and to see where your food is being raised and to shake their hand and to get to know them a little bit. That is the third and maybe the most important thing.
I love that. Like, so we are all three of us are farmers here, but I think most of our listeners, we are speaking to you and saying the weight is not on your shoulders. That's not fair to say, but something that you can do is have conversations with people in your life to talk about the cycle of life, to talk about how food is grown and raised. For weekend activities with your children, take them to farms. Let them see this in real life, how food is grown and raised, so that they can spark conversations with their friends and develop this community of, like you said, curiosity, of relearning this innate wisdom that we had in prior generations when this is what we were exposed to from birth. And so I think just reconnecting in whatever way possible. We're not saying to become a farmer. Most people can't do that, don't want to do that, and you don't have to do that. But at least connecting to them. And if you don't have a local farmer, social media, as much as it sucks, you can now find regenerative farmers or farmers online that are sharing some of this transparency, and follow some of those to learn more about the process or why they do certain things and how the steps it takes to raise a chicken out on pasture or in the trees. And I think I love that you said curiosity. Regain that curiosity and disconnect from food coming from the grocery store. I think that is the thing that consumers can do. The weight is not on your shoulders. I personally believe that, like you brought up a very important percentage. So typically at butcher shops, you said 62%.
67% yield is standard across the industry for yield on a cold carcass weight. And so that's once it's already been gutted and skinned into cuts and grind.
Remember back to the beginning, we're saying that the profit margin is 2%. And so we're only yielding 67% of that. And so what can the system do as a whole to use that remaining percentage, so that there are other avenues of potential revenue so that we can slightly increase that profit margin? That is a very difficult thing. But so if you drive up to a processor, we've driven to so many, and you just see these massive piles of heads, hides, hooves, just in a pile going to landfill.
I mean, I think just like thinking about that might not make sense what that means to people, but that means, in a sense, how can we use more of the animal? And like Kate, you said you make bone broths and stuff, and I'm assuming in some of your grinds you have organ meats.
Yes, absolutely.
So, thinking about using the whole animal a little bit more in your day-to-day, not just the chicken breasts and stuff.
Yes, absolutely. I think that this is really important. I'm going to say a couple of things. And I think number one, the industrial complex is really good at using the whole animal. There's a beautiful book, and I never remember that. It's Pig number 0567, whatever. And it follows all the industries that this animal touches, that, pork byproducts end up in electronics glue. They end up in bone china. Adrenal glands get used in pharmaceuticals. And so there is this component where the industrial complex is incredibly efficient at using these animals. But I think that more of what we're speaking to is that you have, first of all, we need to build up industries that are adjacent to this, regenerative leather or places.
You interviewed someone on your podcast, again,
Yes.
Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. You interviewed your friend who is doing something like that, isn't she?
So my friend Kate Kavanaugh with Range Revolution is really working to build up a regenerative leather supply chain. At this time, processors are paying to have hides carted off that mostly go into landfills, as you mentioned. And so this is yet another place where if the farmer is getting $10, $15, $25 per hide, that's adding a little bit more into that bottom line. If we were to build more supply chains for, heads are tough, but where some of these bones and hooves are going, where it could actually benefit farmers, I think that's a really interesting proposition. But I think that another thing that you see is even if I'm getting 87% yields at the butcher shop on cold carcass weight, that still means that the majority of that is going to be ground beef. And so one of the things that I actually really like to implore of consumers is that ground meat is usually going to comprise around 50% of what farmers and ranchers have for you. And it is one of the most nutrient dense things. I think it's a very underrated source of collagen, actually. When we talk about collagen rich cuts, we rarely mention ground meat. I think that it's a beautiful vehicle for, just like you said, for organ meats. And it really helps move a thing that farmers and ranchers historically across the board struggle to move. And so I think there are little things like that that can actually begin to move the dial. But I also think that within the industry, there is an opportunity for, at the level of slaughterhouse, for us to cut a little bit differently, where we're increasing that yield, and for us to build spaces where maybe there are value-added products that are getting added on. Like, what if we made bone broth at a bigger scale at slaughterhouses? Or what if we utilized some of these smaller cuts in that way?
Yeah. And I like how you said, like, the industrial complex, so the more of the conventional system, they really actually do a good job utilizing it. But that's not being done at the regenerative local food system scale. And so how can we borrow some of what they're doing and implement it in this space? So that way, regenerative ranchers, the ranchers and farmers that I know all of the consumers want to support, but they're not being supported enough right now. And so implementing these type of changes in the production line system can actually help boost that profit margin from 2 to 4%. Let them work less hours off the farm so that they can be better farmers themselves and have more time to be able to better steward their land and take care of their animals. And so for entrepreneur creative thinkers that are listening to this podcast, I challenge you to develop a team to help improve the production system of these local processing units that can give the rancher more dollars back per animal, because that allows the farmer to keep doing the same that they're doing, but get paid more. So how can we use the whole animal?
And I want to say this too. This includes paying slaughter workers better. It has to include that. When your average slaughterhouse worker is making between $15 and $17 an hour, that is not enough for one of the most dangerous jobs in America, one of the most physically intensive jobs in America. And so that has to be a consideration too.
Yeah. Well, I know we've talked about a lot of depressing things. We wanted to kind of give like the real talk of things, but I don't think we should ever end on a bad note. So, Kate, where do you see 10 years from now? The regenerative space has grown more support. Farmers are making more money. What do you think are the necessary steps and realistic steps that we can all get there together? And we've already touched on the consumer and using more of the animal with the processing and butchering side. But do you think that there needs to be kind of more governmental side things, or do you think that it's going to come with kind of creating more avenues of food delivery and food consumption?
Let me ask you this first. I've been thinking a lot about this because I actually think that to say some of these and I was thinking about this morning as I prepared for this podcast and pulled some statistics. I think that there's something hopeful about telling the truth a little bit and about exposing this, that actually is a part of the process. And I was thinking about how depressing some of these statistics are when you put them all together, and how it feels like it's a hopeless situation. And how, for me, I actually feel like there's a lot of hope in having a more transparent and honest conversation as an inflection point for actually really beginning to have generative change. And I'm curious to ask other people how they feel about this, because I've been thinking a lot about this. Like, is the truth depressing or is the truth hopeful?
I mean, I think for our own situation, like Ashley and I are only, basically 3 years, two and a half to 3 years into our journey here farming. And I think, I don't know if, I mean, hopeful is a good word, but I think motivating is a good word too for, when you understand the struggles and you understand the value these foods have in your life and for your health. And, I want great food available for my future kids, and I want to see this survive. And I know there are so many people who feel the exact same way, and their health actually depend on having this food available. It's almost motivating to me to hear this, because I'm like, all right, maybe I wasn't using the bones before, but I'm going to go get some knuckle bones and I'm going to make broth, right? Like I'm going to take that extra step. I'm going to get a little more crunchy, as some people like to call people who go the extra mile with their food. So I think just, understanding the struggles that we've faced over the last few years, at times it's disheartening. Like we've been pretty vocal about it on our social media, but at the same time, every time that we have been, it almost creates more support for what we're doing because people care. So I do think that what you said, that these conversations are like a turning point in a way for some people who listen, and they're like, oh, I see now. And then it causes action to take place. So
I love that you said motivating.
Yeah, I think it's more
if we turn a blind eye and we say, oh, regenerative ranching is not profitable, so I'm just going to go to the grocery store and I'm just going to ignore the whole issue, and we don't talk about why it isn't profitable, that leads to just learned helplessness, the freeze state, and nothing gets done. Yeah. Whereas if we're transparent, we have brilliant minds across the world. And if we talk about these things and we share about our problems, we can all join as a community and talk about realistic solutions. I love the word motivating.
Because like the most basic takeaway, like if I was just a layman listening to this and I heard Kate say that ground beef is a great source of collagen, I would be like, all right, well, I'm going to go buy ground beef, from like the butcher shop or something. I'm not going to have to, I don't have to take.
Well, someone listening, Kate is a butcher. She sees what goes into the ground beef. I watched her cut up a bison. She sees what goes into the ground product. So she's telling you, if you want a balanced amino acid, eat the ground beef.
If you want that methionine to glycine ratio,
there you go.
Where it's at.
Just putting that into perspective, it kind of like simplifies this whole equation to like, that's a very realistic step somebody could take. So like, it doesn't have to be this daunting, depressing conversation at that point. That's a really actionable item for somebody. So I think the way you talk about this and your sheer honesty about your struggles is very inspiring and motivating, and kind of like lights a fire for many people who do value this. You have to have the value first, and obviously that comes, whether that came from a health struggle or it came from, something went wrong in your personal life, blah, blah, blah. So that's my perspective.
Thank you for sharing that. I was genuinely curious, and I think that motivating is a really beautiful word. And Ash, you mentioned something about community. And I think when we're looking at the next 10 years and how we move forward, I think it is actually really through that lens of community and getting out of our silos and taking a very interdisciplinary approach. I think that we need farmers and ranchers working on this. We need consumers with varying backgrounds. We need ecologists working on this. We need physicists working on this and looking at sort of those quantum interactions of the system's view of things. We need nutrition science working on this, right? Like we need all of these disciplines talking to one another. And I think that we so often get really siloed in these spaces. And I think we also have to deeply consider, Sarah, and I think you mentioned this, we need to consider some of the regulatory actions that may or may not need to be taken to make this more accessible. And I do think that you have some states like Wyoming that have really opened up some of the regulations around what farmers can sell directly off their farm. And I think that opening up regulations in some of those manners where you can do more direct to consumer, end user meat where you can process more on farm. I think that really does move the needle for farmers and ranchers. And so I think looking at this from a regulatory standpoint also is necessary, and looking at this from an investment standpoint. I think that there needs to be some shifts in the investment that is available for food producers, for slaughterhouses, for these very important elements of our food system. And I think all of this has to be done together in concert.
And then to bridge the gap between all of those, we need educators to explain to these billion-dollar investors, you should not be supporting any sort of food grown in a lab. And instead, this is where your money will be best spent. And I think that is going to be a key piece in order to bridge this community all together. So that way we can all communicate. We can have the opportunity to all be in the same room rather than working in individual silos.
Yeah, just, again, to share our own experience here, there's been times where I've really questioned what we're doing, and it seems like, oh, this is really daunting and depressing. And, maybe at that time, Ashley saw the vision, so she kept us going, or vice versa. There's a time where Ashley's struggling, but I kept holding on and I saw the vision. So I think this kind of goes into community, but having these conversations more often, like with you, like, yeah, you were saying some depressing things, but at the same time, I'm walking away from this conversation with you feeling like, all right, Ash, let's go. We got to keep educating. We got to keep going, because it really does just depend on, having that curiosity and understanding. And that's not just going to come out of nowhere, right? You got to post that weird reel where the chickens are eating, carcass, like things that get people thinking.
We go to a local butcher shop every single week, and we pick up all the scraps that are going into the landfill, and then we bring it back and give it to our chickens here. And the vegans go crazy on Instagram. They hate it. Mm-hmm. It brings a lot of attention.
Right, like Ashley has analyzed that is actually what
it sparks curiosity and it sparks conversation. Why are chickens eating meat?
Yeah. And so, I love that you brought statistics and you brought the real facts, to light and to surface, because it really does get me more inspired to keep going. So I
think too, and I think that in the same way that we've kind of pushed aside death in so many of these systems, that with it we've siloed grief away too. And I think that there is grief here, right? I think that there is grief at our loss of community. And I think that agriculture accelerated that loss of community. And I think the last 150 years has, accelerated that even more. And I think that there's grief for kind of what we've lost in terms of connection to our food. And I think that sometimes I was relating to someone the other day that anytime I pick up my phone to scroll Instagram, it's usually coming from one of two places. It's either that I am looking for connection, I think in a parasocial relationship, but seeking connection, or I'm avoiding a space of grief in myself. And so I think that there's something to be said for embracing these spaces where it's like, oh, I'm sad that I don't raise my own food anymore, or that I don't have a connection with my food, or I'm sad that I'm farming as just two people instead of in a community that's very supportive of what is an incredibly physical and emotionally laborious job. And so I actually think that is part of a way that we compost this next iteration of agriculture, where we recognize grief and we recognize some of these hardships, and we can then put them all into this pile. And what will happen is the fertile ground that the next iteration grows from.
Absolutely. I love that. And I think, just really quickly, a third reason to scroll is to be inspired. And so people are inspired by what? They're inspired by success, but they also are inspired by struggle and perseverance. And so
resilience.
I think, resilience, being very open about, what this next year looks like for you, no matter if it's, a struggle and you may have to close your doors, or maybe, you find what makes it work. I think that is maybe your contribution to,
amongst many other things.
I mean, like, but a foundational contribution, just that radical honesty to keep the conversation going. Yeah. So that's just going to catapult into something else for you. Like, I don't foresee you stopping, right? Like, you've gotten to this point, and it's just what's next for you.
I'm actually very hopeful on a personal and individual level, regardless of what happens, whether the butcher shop closes or not. There's so much beauty in this process for me, and what this has done in the last 10 years. And I'll say this too, right? Like, we think of success in these very capitalistic terms. It is only what is happening in your bottom line. But in 10 years, that butcher shop has given $6 million back to farmers and ranchers across the Front Range. It has helped to build soil organic matter on thousands of acres. It has supported families that are farming, sent kids to college, and it has nourished, I do not know how many thousands, maybe tens of thousands of families. I have seen children born that their mothers ate that meat while they were pregnant, go on to ask for dry-aged steak for their third birthday. And it has seen people through life, right? Through marriages, through divorces, through deaths, through births, through all of these beautiful things. And so I want to say this too, because we have these single metrics of success, but Western Daughters, whether it survives past, age 10 or 11 or not, has been wildly successful at nourishing a community. And I can close my doors or keep them open with just the biggest heart for knowing that level of success.
And this is a topic that you talked about on one of your podcasts about these skills. If we don't pass these on to the next generation, these skills of butchery, the skills of regenerative ranching, if we don't at least try, share with others, it's going to get lost generation to generation. And so, like you said, it's been tremendously successful, and you've been able to teach yourself, you've been able to hone in on your skills and share with others this beautiful skill of butchery.
I've probably taught about 60 people how to butcher that are now running shops all across the country.
That's passing this skill on that is being lost more and more as we move to lab-made food, where cells of cows are used to print perfect shaped circles on a lab. It's nonsense. And so if you didn't try, that knowledge or skill wouldn't have been passed down. And that, to me, I think is beautiful. And I think that you will find a way to keep your doors open. But if you didn't, you at least now have a model out there of, hey, investors, this is what I tried. This is what didn't work. Someone now take this and do better and continue this. And so I really inspire and motivate you to, these next 12 months, be completely transparent as you are trying to make this work, so that others can hear this story. And I'm not saying that you're not smart, but sometimes it takes that external person to come in and say, this is how we can make it work.
Yes, and I think that you spoke to something really important. And I think that anybody in any industry and anybody within their own business suffers from myopia. We are often too close to be able to have the perspective that we need. And this is why taking a very interdisciplinary approach, this is why community is an important aspect to looking at some of these solutions for the myriad of problems that we've talked about today.
Okay, so let's provide another takeaway then on the topic of community. What can somebody do who's listening to this start to feel like they are able to access a community or form a community themselves to continue to be curious and cultivate these topics we've talked about in their life? What are your top few suggestions for somebody who is scrolling because they want community?
This is a big question for me lately, right? This is how and where do we create community? Because I think that we have lost so much of, whether it was a church or a town center, these places where we came together and found relationship? And I actually don't have a clear answer. This is actually what I'm kind of focusing my next phase of work on, which is how and where do we build community, right? Do we host a dinner in our communities where we get some meat from a local farm and some vegetables from a local farm and host a true conversation where, there's a topic and we hold space at the table to have an in-depth conversation. I recently had one of these and it was very interesting. I don't think I had been at a table of 12 people where there was sort of a specific thematic conversation that everybody was coming to riff on. And so maybe that's an option to really leverage that. But I think that's a really beautiful question. Like, how do we build more community centers? And I think this is around talks. I think it's around shared interest. But my hope is that it's around shared interests that reach across a wide audience, because I think that one of the most important things is that we get out of our own curated silos of people that agree with us, whether that's in a dietary sense or in a political sense or whatever that is, and have more of that community across people that might have very different viewpoints. And I'm curious if your listeners have any ideas, because right now that's really interested to see what community could be.
Yeah, we should try to questions.
I think that I have a hard time with that because we do have a really great community here at the farm. But if I was someone in a suburb where, let's say that I was a mom and there's a group of moms and they all share the same opinion about vegetarianism being the best thing for the environment, and you feel very much like an outcast, that is a very difficult situation, because the goal shouldn't be to change their minds and tell them why they're wrong, but to be able to spark a conversation amongst that group of individuals in a way that sparks curiosity and enables continued conversation rather than immediate reaction and end of discussion. I think that is challenging. That is a very challenging thing because people really care about being a part of that community. They don't want to lose their role there, and they also care about what others think of them. And so navigating that type of space where you are kind of seen as an outcast, and I'm sure most of the people who listen to this podcast, you guys are probably all outcasts. I for sure am. And so navigating normalcy as an outcast is challenging.
Well, and let's identify here, because I think that this is really important. I think fear of being ostracized from the group is perhaps one of the most deeply rooted fears of what it is to be human. Like, we depend on our group. We depend on this social instinct. And so that is a very driving factor. And so maybe that is like an opportunity to have a dinner or to bring in a farmer to that dinner to talk about what they do, or to view a film, or to have a book club that opens up new avenues of conversation without it being about changing minds. And this is where I actually think having conversations that might not be directly related to agriculture, but are more tangential, are interesting. We talk a lot about history and philosophy and things like that on the podcast, because I think that looking at some of the problems that we face in the agricultural community is going to take these different lenses and perspectives. And so it's worth sort of diving into that and seeing where that leads you.
Absolutely. And I know we actually said, social media can stink at times, but sometimes that becomes your community, is finding other like-minded individuals who might not be in your area. And
absolutely.
That's who you kind of bounce ideas back and forth. And maybe you watch some of their content, or you're both experimenting and keep an open mind. And I think that although the comments section of posts can be scary,
just don't even go
you
there.
can also find people who are asking the same questions as you. And, maybe you reach out to somebody. I know that's super weird to think about, but maybe you send somebody a DM and say, hey, I wondered this same thing, or where did you end up buying your meat, or how did that work out for you? I always love seeing when people kind of go back and forth in their own little bubble, like not a, a bad bubble, but a bubble, like a little conversation. And it's beautiful to see that play out on some of our posts, because I'm like, yeah, that's great. Like maybe you guys just, maybe she shifted your perspective or you opened your mind to something. So social media is somewhere I've found that you can find community. And then, so you mentioned dinner parties and having conversations and, sparking the questions. I think some other outlets would be joining cooperatives, or going to farms. You could even maybe start becoming closer with the family, or
volunteering, or
doing things like volunteering at farms.
That's a huge one. Ask your farmer if they need help. They do. They need so much help.
Part of the farm, right? And so we are hosting a milk tasting event this Saturday. This is kind of like our
tomorrow.
Tomorrow. It's kind of our first attempt at establishing a community here with some of our local customers.
Beautiful.
So yeah, I'm really excited. People think like, oh, that's nice for the customer, but like, that's so nice for us, because it's us wanting a community, right? It's not just like, let's hand out our milk. It's like, no, let's have these people come here and let's talk and let's experience this day together. So just keeping the open mind that like, you are not the only one seeking a community. Like there are people out there who have the same drive to create this. And maybe that kind of helps somebody feel a little bit less intimidated.
Yeah. I love that. I think that's fantastic.
All right. So to conclude, Kate, let's first talk about how people can find you. So what's your podcast? What's your social media outlets? And then we'll talk about how people can support you. So first, where can people find you?
So you can find me mostly on my podcast, Mind, Body, and Soil, where we explore a lot about agriculture, history, philosophy. There's a lot of tangential things too, a lot of personal journeys. It is a catch-all for everything. And so much of what we've explored here today, from the regenerative leather conversation, I just had an incredible conversation speaking about the microbiome with an evolutionary biologist. And so lots of fun stuff there. You can find me on Instagram at Kate, Kate _ Kavanaugh, Kavanaughh. Perhaps more importantly, you can find a farm right near you on my website, groundworkcollective.com, where we have a massive farm finder of over 2,000 regenerative farms across the United States that you can sort by all of these different metrics. And
I had no idea.
I know, I'm hiding that one. Groundwork Collect. I'll send you a link, so all of this can end up in the show notes. So those are some of the best places to find me, and everything kind of branches out from there.
Okay, and then I know that there are listeners located in Colorado, and so to talk about your butcher shop, again, say the name, if there's a website, how people can make bookings there, and how a consumer can support you.
Yeah. So Western Daughters, we're in Denver, Colorado. We are a retail butcher shop. So you can just come in and see us Tuesday through Sunday, 10 to 7, and buy some meat from the case. WesternDaughters.com, at Western Daughters on Instagram to learn more. We also have a small restaurant where we do all regeneratively raised meat that is grass-fed and pasture-raised, seed oil-free, sugar-free, and we have A2 grass-fed coffee and milk in our coffee, just all the good stuff. So you can support us there as well.
That is what the people want. That right there.
It is what the people want.
How can we take this model and put it across the country at different areas?
I want a Western daughter in my small town.
I do.
I know.
Daughters.
That's the question. That's the real question.
Cool. Well, Kate, thank you so much for your time today. We had to reschedule several times due to technology problems and goats getting out and all the fun stuff around a farm. So we really appreciate your time today, and we will definitely have you on again to continue this conversation and check in on how the butcher shop is going. So thank you again, Kate.
It was such a pleasure to be here. It was really fun to have this conversation. So thank you.
I think the grieving part is part of the process. You kind of got to go through that, but then you have to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and take action. So take action. If this is something that you are, really like a strong feeling this could be something for you, and remember, 25% of the population is susceptible, has that gene. So I wouldn't put it past you if you've tried everything, you're dealing with chronic illness, and you cannot get better.
All right. Well, with that, until next time, guys, stay
Rooted in resilience.